Raise some
Cain. You gotta raise some Cain. In the heartland where the faith runs strong, we've seen the shadows growing long. Watch those around us be deceived. Yeah, the fight is at our doors, no matter who we believe. Corruption, lawless day and night, we'll speak the truth into the light. We'll bring the battle, heed the call, watch the whole thing fall. We gotta raise some Cain, show the lies, break some chains and make things right. Feel the power, be the change, time is now. We gotta raise some Cain.
Welcome to another round of the Raising Cain Show, where we dive into bold ideas with fearless conversation. Today, we're joined by Dr. Murray Sabrin, economist, professor emeritus, and champion of liberty. From his roots as the son of Holocaust survivors to founding the Sabrin Center for Free Enterprise, he's a leading voice in free markets and individual freedom. His books like Why the Federal Reserve Sucks and From Immigrant to Public Intellectual challenge the status quo. Stick around. We're diving into the economy, healthcare, and the fight for liberty right after this break.
It says, I woke up this morning and looked out the door to a country I don't recognize. They put masks on our face to hide our pain, and there's no fire in most people's eyes. And it's still true today. It's still true today that they've tried to destroy the American spirit. And in some instances, they've done a dadgum good job. But in other instances, they have lit an inferno in some people. And we right now are gathering some of those people that are on freaking fire to save this country.
Increasing expenses have caused us all a lot of pressure these days, and it's affecting even the wealthiest of people. Most have lost their sense of security, stability, and even hope for a strong financial future. The game plan of everyone in your cell phone has likely been disrupted or even hardcore stopped, and most are looking for a creative solution to regain financial momentum. Oftentimes, life's best solutions are the simplest. But first, a question. What is something most people think they should own but don't? Crypto, fine art, real estate? Nope. We are talking about real money. The kind kings and queens fought for and large institutions today buy in mass. We're talking about gold and silver, assets that provide confidence in tough financial situations. So the question is, do you own any? If you don't, you're not alone. Most people aren't maximizing the power of precious metals because it's just been too complicated. And even though they see advertisements about gold and silver daily, they don't really know who to trust. That is, until now. The bottom line is that buying gold and silver doesn't have to be complicated or scary. There's a simple, better way to accumulate assets and create financial peace, headache-free. And this very minute, a new community of average people are seeing above average results to the tune of tens of millions in assets over the last few years. This system is tested, it's simple, and it's not an experiment. To date, it's helped more than 80,000 people bring hope back into their lives. It's invitation only, and right now, this new community has accepted a challenge to give away as much free gold this year as possible. Curious? Learn how to get your free gold today. Check out the next step to get the details.
Since 2017, 150,000 farms have shut down. Working farmland has been reduced by 21 million acres. The system has been crippling the remaining farmers, forcing some to adopt nefarious farming techniques, like pumping hormones and other performance-enhancing drugs into their cows so they can survive in crammed feedlots. Or the farmers are forced to jump ship and sell to land-hoarding, profit-chasing agricultural oligarchies, who use their billions of dollars to crush the competition and increase your family's dependence on their manufactured food. What could possibly go wrong? The family farm will soon be a thing of the past, unless you do something. You can. That's why there's From the Farm, an industry-disrupting platform that connects consumers directly with local farmers, which means you can buy fresh, non-factory farm food, and you'll know exactly where your food came from and how it was raised. For the first time in nearly 100 years, independent farms will have a way to not only survive, but thrive. From the Farm was founded by A.J. Richards, an active homesteader, and Brooke Entz, a CrossFit Games athlete and an Amazonian warrior in the movies Wonder Woman and Justice League. She clearly has a passion for healthy food and a healthy lifestyle. And since both AJ and Brooke come from generations of ranchers and farmers, they know what they're talking about. We can't do this alone. We need the strength of the American people behind us. Help us build a new food system that combines the wisdom of the past with the technology of the future. Investing in From the Farm isn't just a financial decision. It's an investment into our future, our small family farms, and our food sovereignty. Invest today.
And we're back on the Raising Cain Show, where bold ideas meet unfiltered truth. Thanks for sticking with us. Let's dive in with our guest, Dr. Murray Sabrin, a titan of free market economics and a fearless advocate for liberty. Born in Western Germany to Holocaust survivors, he immigrated to America, earned a PhD from Rutgers, and became an emeritus professor of finance at Ramapo College. There, he and his wife founded the Sabrin Center for Free Enterprise to champion markets and challenge government overreach. A Mises Institute scholar and author of provocative books like Why the Federal Reserve Sucks, The Finance of Healthcare, and his memoir, From Immigrant to Public Intellectual, An American Story, Dr. Sabrin has also run for office to fight for freedom. Get ready for a deep dive into the economy, healthcare, taxation, and the future of liberty. Dr. Sabrin, thank you so much for joining the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Nate. It's always great to have a discussion with a real patriot and a defender of the Constitution.
Well, thank you. I appreciate those comments. I am really fascinated by your story. Your family history is extraordinary. Survivors of the Holocaust who rebuilt their lives in America. How did your parents' resilience influence your commitment to individual liberty?
Well, that's a great question. I didn't think about it much as a youngster, because as a youngster, you're just trying to get through day to day, week to week, do well in school so your parents will be proud of you. And I just did that. I remember when we moved to the Bronx in 1953, entered the second grade, and my parents basically said to me, your job is to get an education. So I didn't stop till I got a PhD.
Wow. So now your early career focused on history and geography education, which I find that interesting because there's so much. I'm very interested in geopolitics and understanding geography and understanding how geography shapes basically wars and shapes, the countries. I mean, I've heard so much about that just in talking with people from different parts of the world. And I'm very curious about what sparked your shift from that to championing free enterprise and libertarian ideas.
Well, when I was in junior high school, I was intrigued with architecture, and I thought maybe I'd become an architect. And so when I was in high school, I took a course in mechanical drawing, and I wasn't very good at it. So I said, why pursue something that I really don't have a passion for or don't have some innate skill to do it? And then I decided as a junior in high school to become a social studies teacher. And I majored in history and geography. One of the best gifts I got, Nate, and you'll appreciate this, is when I had my bar mitzvah at age 13, it's always at age 13. I just want to confirm that I got a beautiful atlas as a gift. Everyone else gave me either a savings bond or cash, but this one couple came late to the reception, and they came with this big package, and it was this huge atlas with every region of the world, all the 50 states. And I started leafing through it. And remember, this was the period before Africa was decolonized. So I saw all the colonies that the British, the French had in Africa and Asia. It was just fascinating to read through it. And so I really got hooked on geography at that time and decided to become a social studies teacher. I concentrated in social studies education, was a history major, geography minor, and got a master's in social studies education. So I studied every region of the world. And one of the most fascinating courses I had as an undergraduate during the Vietnam era was a course in political geography, where I learned the heartland theory by Mackinder, the British geographer, that talked about the heartland and the world island. And if you look at the map of the world, you see where American foreign policy has been after World War II. It was in the Korean Peninsula, Vietnam, and now the Mideast and Ukraine. And what do those areas have in common? Well, if you draw a line from Korea to Vietnam to the Mideast to Ukraine, it is the perimeter of the heartland. And so American foreign policy is based upon the notion that we have to contain the two great powers that are in the heartland, China and Russia. And remember, McKinley was writing before the Soviet Union and before Communist China were created. So he had this insight that this is what U.S. foreign policy and British foreign policy should do, namely contain the two great powers that are in the heartland.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. You mentioned about as a child, it really hitting you when you were given this atlas. And you reminded me of something. You know, my parents, I've always been fascinated by geography and nations and history. And I was a terrible student of history, mainly because I think I had a teacher that didn't bring it to life, but I educated myself about it. And one of the things that helped me was my parents had subscribed me to a National Geographic, magazine. And I had for about maybe 5 years, I got every month, I had a new one, and they came with maps back then. And so I had all of these National Geographic maps all over my walls in my room. And I really had this desire to learn and understand about different cultures. And I got a chance to live in Japan for 3 years and live in Korea for a year. And we, lived in Hawaii for 3 years, which even though it's part of the United States, it is its own culture in a way.
Sure.
And so there's so many fascinating things. And we've lived all over the US. And even in the US, you've got various cultures and differences between, different people. So, how do you go from that into the world of finance and economics? Because that was something that didn't take hold of me. In fact, in college, economics I found to be a very difficult course, mainly because I couldn't wrap my head around this idea that if you have, resources that are running out and people who are taking those resources, it doesn't seem like it was going to be a good end, So I was very curious about that, and so I'm really. How did you go from geography to finance?
Well, I was always interested in current events. That was one of my favorite subjects as a junior high school student and high school student. And when I got into college, I subscribed to Newsweek, and I was starting to read Newsweek about all the current events that were occurring in the United States and around the world. And I was reading Milton Friedman's column. He was one of three rotating economists in Newsweek, and I started reading his columns, and they were critical of big government policies and government intervention hurts people, especially minorities, with the minimum wage. A fascinating piece that he wrote about that. And then in 1969, my wife and I were visiting her sister and husband in upstate New York, and we stopped at this bookstore in Syracuse. And there was a book on the shelf that I looked at, and I said, "This looks interesting." It was Ayn Rand's "Capitalism: The Unknown Ideal," a collection of essays that she and other analysts wrote about, and especially Alan Greenspan's piece called Gold and Economic Freedom, where he talked about the Great Depression and how gold prevents government from getting larger and larger by making it difficult for government to borrow money if we had a gold standard. And then, of course, 2 years later, Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold, imposed wage price controls, which was supposed to be anathema to Republicans who say they believe in limited government and free enterprise. And now Nixon is doing what LBJ and FDR did previously, intervene heavily in the economy. And so I realized that, and I'd been teaching in New York City public schools at the time, because there was a surplus of social studies teachers. They asked me to teach math because I had a pretty good math background. And I realized I didn't want to have a full-time career as a New York City school teacher. So in 1972, with the support of my wife, I went to graduate school full-time at Rutgers, commuted 4 days a week for the first couple of years. Had to live through the first oil crisis in 1973, which made getting gas very difficult.
That probably cemented your ideas right then.
Goodness, I wrote President Nixon a letter saying, get rid of price controls on gasoline and we'd have more gasoline. And I went up to the Foundation for Economic Education, which is located about 20 miles north of where we live in the city. And I picked up a whole bunch of free market books from Henry Hazlitt to Elizabeth von Mises to Murray Rothbard, and I started reading it. And this was 1974, early 1974. And my dissertation topic popped out, Murray Rothbard's discussion of how new money enters an economy and then spreads through that economy, causing prices to rise. And that was my dissertation topic, where I analyzed how the U.S. economy unfolded from 1967 to 1971. So I wrote that dissertation. Murray Rothbard was a member of my dissertation committee because I was allowed to have an outside member of Rutgers. And so it was great having him on the committee. He pointed out books and articles I should read. And I just immersed myself in financial and economic history because that explains how the world evolved. Because there were books written about Charles Adams' book about taxation, history of taxation, that affected world civilization. And of course, the money issue, which has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, affected civilization as well. And of course, the Vietnam was winding down. We finally got out of Vietnam in April of 75. And so my whole worldview, based upon my family's history of surviving World War II, came to the realization that big government is the root of our problems. In fact, there was a book about that in 1954, Frank Chodorow, member of the old right, who wrote The Income Tax, Root of All Evil. And so if the government has the ability to tax us, it could redistribute money for the welfare state and create this massive military-industrial complex that Eisenhower and others warned us about throughout the post-war period. And here we are today with $37 trillion of debt, $2 trillion of deficits, a $7 trillion plus budget. And both Republicans and Democrats are responsible for this because no single party has been in control for the past 100 years since we got the income tax and the Federal Reserve. So my perspective is politics has ruined America's path toward greater and greater freedom. We've gone away from what the founders gave us with the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which I've been writing about for the past several months, that the Constitution supposedly was going to limit the size and scope of government if the president, whoever that president was, and members of Congress, no matter which party they belong to, adhere to Article 1, Section 8 as to what they could spend money on. But that's been ignored. And that's why that's the real constitutional crisis we face in America.
Yeah. And in fact, just the fact that you look at the Constitution and it lays out what the numbers are supposed to be in terms of, how many representatives, and we don't even follow that. I mean, we've got 700,000 people per representative. How can they represent that many people? Yeah. That's part of the problem too. It becomes almost impossible to unseat somebody once they get in there. And they get in there through a lot of money is how they get in there, because it costs a lot of money just to be able to run the ads. You can't go and knock on enough doors, in a district to be able to reach that many people, 700,000 within a, election cycle. So it forces basically money to be the biggest way that people get elected. And that is a problem I see, because we don't have people representing us often, who actually are listening to the people and doing the will of the people. And then even
Well,
when the people say, hey, we don't like this guy, getting them out of there, it becomes damn near impossible.
Well, that's why I think term limits is one answer. I don't think it's the answer, but clearly we have term limits for the president with the,
Right.
I forgot what amendment that was after FDR passed away. They passed an amendment to limit the president to 2 terms. And members of Congress can stay there as long as they want. They either resign because of
Yeah.
some scandal, or they die in office, or they just had enough and decide I can't achieve anything worthwhile. And so they leave. And that's why I think it's we should rethink the whole notion of no term limits for members of Congress. I think something reasonable as 12 years, 2 terms for senators, and
Yeah.
6 terms for members of Congress, and have that rotation in office that I think the founders envisioned. They didn't envision a political class that would be in office for virtually their all adult life.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the shame of where the country is politically, that we have people in Congress. And there was a wonderful book written decades ago called The Culture of Spending, which points out no matter which party you belong to, the longer you're in office, the greater likelihood you will vote for big spending. And this cuts across a party line, because no one wants to say no in Washington because it's not their money. That's the real issue.
Right.
It's your money. You're not going to spend money on things that people ask you for if it comes out of your pocket, but it comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. Okay, I'm going to vote for trillion-dollar budgets or multi-trillion-dollar budgets because it doesn't affect me directly.
Yeah. Well, that brings up a good point. You know, you talk about because it's not their money, but in the same respect, they seem to just print money out of thin air. And so, of course, ultimately that devalues the US dollar. And, you know, and I've heard different theories and different people talk about things. Well, having a weak dollar is a good thing, or having a strong dollar is a good thing. Ultimately, I see a major problem when our dollar is propped up by essentially the petrodollar. And now you've got countries that are saying, okay, we're not going to play that game anymore. And you got the BRIC nations that are aligning, to be able to buy oil without having to, take the US dollar out of surplus, where it's basically circulation, on steroids outside the United States. I can't remember the numbers, but it was a significantly large amount of US dollars that are in circulation outside of our country. And so what happens when all of a sudden all that money comes back flooding into our borders? We're going to see major inflation problems, I think, is what most experts are saying. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's exactly right. When I was investigating the history of inflation for the past 200 years, what struck me is that nations that have seen hyperinflation, where prices go up 50 cents in a month, 50 cents in a week. The famous case, of course, is Germany in 1923, where prices just went skyrocketing. And it took 4.2 trillion marks to buy a dollar, when before World War I, it was 4.2. So the German mark depreciated by a trillion times in just 9 years. What happens? The scenario that typically happens when a country's currency collapses is that the national government spends money it doesn't have. It runs huge deficits. Then the central bank steps in, buys up the debt, prints up money, and then we're off to the races. And that's what's happened in Argentina. It happened in Russia in World War I, led to the Communist Revolution. It happened in China after World War II, and led to the hyperinflation that led to Mao Zedong taking over in 1949 with the communists. It happened in Hungary, Argentina. It's happened all over the world when money goes wild, because the central bankers just print it up in order to balance the books of the national government. And we're not that far away. By that, I mean, it's not going to happen tomorrow, next year, or the year after. But if spending is not under control in the United States, what will the Federal Reserve do in terms of buying up the debt that others, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Europeans, and the OPEC nations will not buy, because they know that if you keep on printing money, you're going to devalue the money that's you already own and the treasury securities that you own, and therefore they're buying gold. We know that central banks have been buying gold the last couple of years, and I think that's going to continue because that's real money. It's you cannot devalue gold. In fact, gold has gone from $35 an ounce in 1971 to nearly $3,500 an ounce. So it's up nearly 100 times because there's so many dollars that have been printed that are all over the world. You could probably go into the jungles of the Amazon and find $100 bills. They're all over the place.
Yeah.
And we were very close to a dollar meltdown in 1979 in the Carter administration, before China was a powerful economic entity, when we were printing up money in the late 70s. And gold went from $440 to $850 in a matter of 5 months. And Volcker was appointed by Carter, and he raised interest rates in order to stop the inflation. And inflation went from 12% to 3% in 3 years, a great achievement, which helped set the stage for the boom of the 1980s and 90s, plus Carter's deregulation. So again, printing money, manipulating interest rates. That's why I wrote the book, Why the Federal Reserve Sucks. And because it's about the Federal Reserve trying to manage a $28 trillion economy by manipulating interest rates. And it cannot be done. There's no way you could achieve that because it's a form of central planning. And that's why I and others believe that we need to go back to real money, which is gold and silver. And either we devalue the dollar and reset the dollar in terms of gold, or we have the Treasury do it, or we just get the government out of the money area, which is what Professor Rothbard wrote about in his monographs before he passed away. And everyone should read it. What has government done to our money? The case for 100% gold dollar, the case against the Fed, and Ron Paul, former congressman, presidential candidate, has written about that also. So there's a vast literature critiquing central banking in general and the Federal Reserve in particular. And we should realize that money in the hands of powerful bankers can lead to not conflict, but depreciation and devaluation.
Yeah. When I was running for Congress, one of the issues that I ran on that a couple of my constituents actually brought my attention to and really challenged me, and they won me over on this idea, was the idea that as a state, we need to go to, basically having our own gold and silver currency, and having a state trust exchange, basically, that because in the inevitability of the dollar failing, we need to be able to have some other means of economy within our states. And there are some states that have already moved in that direction. I think Texas is one of those, Montana, there's several others that have, Nevada, that have started developing gold backs and silver backs and things like that. That the idea, though, I think that where they need to take it to the next level is not just make it about holding and collecting it for the purposes of value, but also being able to use it as legal tender, which the Constitution actually does allow, but only in the case of gold and silver. You can't print fiat currency, in your state that is, separate. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think that that is at least a solution? And I'm curious to know too, if you had a magic wand and you could make any decision in regards to the Fed, what would you do? Would you reform it? Would you replace it? Would you axe it? What would be your solution?
Well, ideally, in a free market, free society, the government would have nothing to do with money, just that it would have nothing to do with a lot of things that we use, cell phones and computers and things like that. That's all done through the marketplace, where people present the product and then offer it for sale. Same thing with money. I mean, the origin of money is very simple. We went from barter to using a commodity that is scarce, rare, homogeneous, portable, easily divisible. These are all the characteristics of money. Paper is not money. Paper is a money substitute. So again, if we made the dollar as good as gold, and I love that term, make the dollar as good as gold, then we could keep the Fed and let it just issue gold coins, or the Treasury can do it. And the Treasury already issues gold coins, but they're not legal tender per se, and they have a goofy face value. They're not based upon the value of the gold content. So instead of having dollars, we could have coins based upon weight, and that's exactly what gold was in the past. It was a weight of something. It would be grams or grains or whatever the case may be. And of course, the big transactions, that would be pounds. So again, there's so many proposals out there that would either strengthen the dollar or sever the link between the money and the government. And this is something that Trump should call for. He should call for a commission on how to restore the strength of the dollar based upon sound money and financial principles. That would be a worthwhile endeavor of his administration to show he's serious about making America great again, which is what I consider something that needs to be reformed to make Americans financially independent. That's why I put on my Maffei hat. That's what it means. Make Americans financially independent. And the way we become financially independent is we have a money that we can use based upon the reliability that it's not going to lose its purchasing power for the time. In fact, in a free market economy, Nate, and this is something most people don't know about, in a free market economy, prices gently go down. That's how living standards increase for everybody. Right. Because if your wages stay the same and prices go down 2-3% a year, that means your real income is going up 2-3% a year. And if that continues indefinitely, everyone's living standards go up, and you don't need all these poverty programs, anti-poverty programs by the government.
Now, I want to ask you about that, because this is something that has shifted, I think, in my view of things. And I used to be 100% for just total free market economy, including globalization. And hey, you know, it's great when we can have computers made cheap in China, all of that. I now have reformed that thinking to understanding that there are certain problems, right, with national security if we don't have medicine, you know, being made here in the United States, if we don't have semiconductors being made here in the United States, if everything that we need to survive is imported, that becomes a danger just as much as you know, as not having the ability to you know, to get cheap labor on some of these things. So how do we balance that? And do you see a need to balance that? And is there a way that we can? Because that is where I see Trump is kind of pulling back now and saying, hey, we need to pull some of these industries back into the United States. We saw massive amount of jobs, you know, that went overseas, and a lot of those jobs affected very badly West Virginia, especially in the northern panhandle and the Ohio River Valley, especially as steel, you know, was basically shut down. Steel mills were shut down. And you saw a lot of that go overseas to China, and they were dumping, you know, and all of that. How do we balance that?
That's a great question. And let me just say that a trade deficit is not a problem. We all run trade deficits with our local supermarket. We all run trade deficits with our internet companies. We all run trade deficits with our cell phone companies. We buy from them. They don't buy anything from us. We earn income. We buy the things that we need. And as an American who believes in the principles of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, to me, that means we buy from whomever we want, wherever they're located. Having said that, if Trump really wants to make the United States a beacon for industrial activity and other activity that has gone overseas, he should call for the immediate end of the corporate income tax, which would make the American economy the freest economy in the world. And every major business would want to locate here because they wouldn't have to pay an income tax. And then people say, well, that's a giveaway to the rich. Well, who does the corporations employ? People. We would increase the number of jobs seamlessly in the country. This is out of the box thinking. No one in Washington is thinking about this. No one on the podcast or the talking heads on cable TV are talking about it. It's about getting us back to a free market economy in its fullest extent. And the way I would advise Trump, call for the elimination of the income tax. Corporations would then have to do their own infrastructure, the roads and everything else locally, so they wouldn't be a burden on taxpayers. And they would pay for all the things that they need in order to operate their factories and other businesses in the country, the data centers and so on and so forth. They could partner with the utility companies to bring in power to the data centers, which take a lot of juice. So again, this is the out-of-the-box thinking that we need to explore, because I'm convinced it would make the United States, a lot of manufacturing would come back, a lot of industries would come back, and people would say, oh my God, the United States is going through a zero corporate income tax. And then you would have the domino effect. This would be the domino in Europe and other places, maybe not immediately, but can you imagine U.S. corporations not having to pay any income tax? They would be able to do everything that they need. We would also get rid of, this is another beauty part of this proposal, it would get rid of corporate welfare, lock, stock, and barrel. No more grants, no more subsidies to any corporation. The farmers would be freed up. They wouldn't have to worry about estate taxes or anything like that. There would be a huge economic boom, greater than anything we've seen in American history. And this is why the thinking in Washington is, how can we manipulate the current system with tariffs and grants and all these other things to make the economy stronger? I contend it's not going to make the economy stronger. What's going to make the economy stronger is more economic freedom.
Well, I think Trump is using the tariffs really more as a negotiating tool. It seems that way because, like, he's threatened major tariffs on certain things, and then he backs off of that once he gets what he wants. And we're seeing that, like with Mexico, for example. So I don't think it's 100% about the trade deficit, although I think that's what he kind of, was preaching it as at first. I think he's using it more as a tactic. And of course, there's Supreme Court arguments right now that are going on as to whether or not that is legal. Now, the one thing that I do think that we have to keep in mind when it comes to, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but from my opinion, I see the corporate income tax, especially for when you take, and I'm just saying this as a person who has my own business, the amount of taxes that I get hit with as an entrepreneur is just unbelievable. I mean, it's so overtly ridiculous. And they do things in a way that basically forces me to put my business into rather than having it as a solely owned, proprietorship where I'm taxed through the nose, they make me jump through all these legal hurdles in order to, change my company into a corporation, maybe get in business with other people that isn't necessarily a good idea. I don't understand why we do the things that we do to entrepreneurs. If we had no income tax, there would be, I think, a lot more people becoming entrepreneurs, starting businesses, trying to get out there. But it's like, if you start a business, you are going to pay through the nose in taxes. Now, how do we solve that? Because if we get rid of income tax, we get rid of corporate income tax, we get rid of how would we function in terms of like the military and those necessary services that we have the government do? Granted, there's a lot they do that they could do without, or we could do without, but
yeah, the corporate income tax last fiscal year that ended September 30th of 2024, raised $530 billion. I bet you the Doge team can find $530 billion of expenditures that could be cut quickly. So you wouldn't have a negative impact on the budget. But the point is, the budget is too large to begin with because virtually everything except military defense and a few other things are not authorized by the Constitution.
That's right.
By reducing the burden on small businesses, and some people are discouraged from going to business because the taxes and federal, state, and local taxes and all the other things that you have to comply with. I mean, the cost of compliance, according to the Tax Foundation, I think is several $100 billion a year. That is money that is totally wasted. It doesn't add anything to the well-being of the American people and the American entrepreneur. So this is what Trump should do. He should call upon the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., that's been writing about this for 40, 50 years. And they can show them what needs to be done in terms of regulation, because regulation is essentially a tax. In order to be legal with the government, you have to comply with their regulations. So that's an indirect tax. So when you add up the direct taxes and indirect taxes, we are suffocating in taxes. But the wonderful thing about America, Nate, is that with all the burdens placed on the American people, the American businesses, we still have an incredible living standard for a vast majority of the American people. That shows you the resiliency of the free market. What I'm advocating is, let's expand that so we don't need all these anti-poverty programs. People will be employed at decent wages based upon their skill levels, and we would have the golden age that Trump talks about. But you're not going to have a golden age with tariffs. You're going to have a golden age with economic freedom by cutting spending, by cutting taxes, by cutting regulation, and getting the Federal Reserve out of the business of manipulating interest rates.
Yeah. Well, how does the Fed's monetary policy fuel the boom bust cycle, and why does it disproportionately hurt the middle class?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I started reading about this more than 50 years ago, I said, boy, they just keep on making the same mistake over and over again. That's the definition of insanity, right? Expecting a different result when you keep on printing money and manipulating interest rates. What the Fed does is buy government bonds from authorized dealers. That money is deposited in the banks. The banks have more money. They lower interest rates in order to attract borrowers. Those borrowers take the money thinking that, hey, there's a lot of savings in the economy, and they expand their businesses, and you get a boom. You hire workers, you pay for more raw materials, and you get a boom in commodity prices. You get a boom in income, and so everything looks great, like it did in the 1920s, because there was no price inflation in the 1920s because of the great productivity. But the Federal Reserve's money printing led to the boom in the stock market and the real estate market, and we know how that ended in 1929, and it lasted for a full decade because of Hoover and Roosevelt's mismanagement of the economy. And so this is the process of boom and then bust, and then they just repeat the cycle over and over again since the Federal Reserve was created. In the 19th century, the banks just printed money, and that's why they were called banking panics, because they were supposed to have gold and silver in reserve, and people thought that the banks didn't have enough money in reserves to back up the deposits at the bank. They had to run on the bank, and that's how you got the boom-bust cycle. That famous scene at the end of It's a Wonderful Life, where people go try to get their money out of the Bailey Savings and Loan. George Bailey says the money's not here, it's in Joe's house because he borrowed money from here. So what the banks do, they borrow short and lend long, which is what happened throughout the 19th century. And that's why we need to go to sound banking, which is 100% reserves and time deposits for longer loans, such as 3-month, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year loans. You have a CD that matches the loan that the bank wants to make, and that would put the risk on the banker and the borrower and the depositor. And so that could be worked out through contractual obligations. But in the meantime, we have the banks that are they're supposedly in pretty good shape today. But the point is, there could be a bank run Monday morning. People could go to their local bank and try to get the money out, and the banks wouldn't have the money. And then we would have a real financial crisis in our hand. But in the meantime, we need to reform our monetary system. We need to downsize the federal government. We have to get rid of unnecessary regulation. And as you know, we have troops all over the world, and that doesn't do anything for the defense of America. The troops should be brought home. The borders should be secure. People should come to America like we did in 1949. My father was vetted in West Germany by an American, I guess, either a State Department representative or somebody from the government. And we came to America having the proper documentation. And so that's the way people have been coming to America. Some people came the old-fashioned way. Also, they jumped the boats wherever they were coming from. And so people came through the back door instead of the front door. But the point is, we need to have a rational immigration policy. We need to have workers people come here to work. These workers, people who come here, they're mostly coming here to work because of the lack of opportunity in their home country. So I empathize with those people because that's what we did. My father started working in a pencil factory at $1 an hour in 1949, 1950. So this is the way America has unfolded for hundreds of years. And I think if we had policies in place that encouraged coming through the front door, I think that immigration problem would go away.
Do you? Well, I think that the idea sounds great on paper, but in practicality, the problem is that we have a welfare state, and as long as we do, we can't have an open door policy with anybody coming into our country, because they'll come here and become a sap on the country, like what we've seen in the last 4 years. Now, when they come in through, the front door and they come in legally, and they have to show proof that they have the ability to take care of themselves.
Right.
I think that's a good system, and I think that we should be open to that. Although I do think there is something important about preserving at least some level of American culture and ensuring that people assimilate. What we've seen happen in some places, like up in certain parts of Michigan and others, where they've moved a ton of people, from various parts of the world that have no commonality with American culture, and you see these areas that are being cordoned off, and you see Sharia law and stuff like that being proposed in certain parts of Michigan, which is just crazy. I do have concerns about that. The other thing that I'm concerned about too, and I see a real problem with this, and I don't know again what the solution is. I go back and forth, is this notion that the United States shouldn't be involved in all of these wars all over the world and everything. There was a point in my life where I felt like we needed to take a leadership role. And then I took hey, you know what? This has not been good for America. Look at all the Middle East, wars that we were in, and how ridiculous that was, and the cost of, and what did we get from it? Nothing. Just continued, infighting and wars and stuff like that. And we didn't even get, not even oil contracts out of it. It was ridiculous. But there is part of me that does see that if we don't have some involvement around the world, and let's just say that we pulled back completely, we said we're not going to have any military outside of our borders. We're only going to have defensive, military, no offensive military. I could see a country like China eventually taking over several of the nations surrounding them. I could see, these expansionist ideologies and policies really, pushing these, pushing their way across the country, and see us in another world war type of situation, getting dragged into it. And this was what Eisenhower really talked about. Everybody loves to quote his quote about the military-industrial complex, and about the fear that having that would cause, basically it would cause the governments not to sue for peace, but to sue for war, because of how much money is involved in warfare and the development of weapons and all of that. But at the same time, he did say we needed an armistice industry, because what World War II showed us was that we didn't have the luxury of being able to switch our factories over from making plows to making tanks, and and making nylons to making parachutes. That the doing that was a very dangerous proposal in a world where we could be at another global world war at any given time. And so he felt like we needed an arms, and there's arguments that are made, and I've granted, and I'll give you fair disclosure, I've spent 27 years of my life working in the Defense Department in some way, shape, or form, or the intelligence community in some way, shape, and form. And so I'm coming at it from that understanding and knowledge, and seeing that one of the reasons that our military is so powerful and so great is because we are well practiced around the world. We're constantly involved in conflict, and that has given us a lot of real world experience in military, tactics and strategy. So there, again, it seems like there's a balance somewhere there. And I don't know where that line is.
Well, there is a balance. The responsibility of every national government is to make sure that there's peace between them and their neighbors. I think President Kennedy outlined it in his American University commencement address. Everyone should watch it on YouTube, June of 1963, where he called basically having peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union at the height of its power, at the height of our power. And 5 months later, he was assassinated. So again, when you look at that timeline, and then Khrushchev was ousted a year after Kennedy was assassinated. They both wanted peace because they realized that, as Albert Einstein famously said, World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. And so I grew up during the Vietnam era. I was an undergraduate. Every night I listened to the debate on radio of the pro-Vietnam and the anti-war position on radio. And it was fascinating to hear people say that the domino theory is real, that if we don't stop the communists in Vietnam, they're going to take over Laos, Cambodia, and all of Southeast Asia. And that was a myth. That was just not a realistic assessment, because Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist. He tried to get U.S. help after World War II to recognize Ho Chi Minh as the leader of Vietnam, because it was a French colony, and the French did some very nasty things in Vietnam. And we visited Vietnam years ago, and I can tell you from speaking to the Vietnamese people and some of the former soldiers there, they hated the French. They hated the Chinese. The Chinese ruled Vietnam for 1,000 years. There's no love lost between the different nations in the region, because they see China as an adversary. They see China as the dominant power, and they don't want to be subjected to Chinese power. So they will stand up for themselves, I believe. And we should not be involved in trying to be the world's policeman. I think that has been a failure of American foreign policy. Senator Robert Taft from Ohio, he was opposed to NATO in 1947. He said this would not be a good thing for the American people. And his support in the House was Congressman Howard Buffett, the father of Warren Buffett, who famously said, it's not our responsibility to export our values to the rest of the world. Everyone else around the world has to figure out how to live with their neighbors in peace. And that's the tragedy that we've had throughout world history, that people haven't been able to get along with each other internally and externally. And that's why we've had 200 million or more people die at the hands of government for the past 200 years. So again, from my family history, from my experience as a student during the Vietnam era, and the history of America since the 1970s, demonstrates that military intervention, military conflict does not solve anything. It just creates bigger and bigger government.
So when you look at our military preparedness or readiness, and again, I'm coming at this from the standpoint of national security, right? I mentioned this already about trade and about the issue of, if all of our industries go overseas and we're dependent upon other nations for, goods and resources that are necessary for the survival of our nation, right? Medicine, steel, whatever, oil, energy, gas, although I don't see any reason why we need that from anywhere, because the vast resources of that are in our country. But when we do that, there's a risk, right? But in the same, I would say, is true of our military. If we majorly scaled down the size of our military, I do think that there is an argument to be made that if we stop being interventionists for every other nation, they might start carrying their own water. We've seen that with NATO, that nobody has been paying, their NATO dues, at least not what they're supposed to be paying to be a part of NATO. And yet, here we are, having to send troops all over the place. And the other thing too, that's very disturbing and frustrating to me about the whole NATO relationship is that one could argue that that's the reason Russia invaded the Ukraine, was over the threat of NATO expanding into Ukraine.
Yep.
And I think it could be argued, and I think there's very good evidence that the CIA was involved in overthrowing a duly elected government in the Ukraine that was very pro-Russian, and putting in our puppet government.
Yep.
And all of these things that we've been involved with, which are kind of relics of the Cold War, that they have created the situation that we're in today, in regards to the Ukraine and Russia war. And now you've got countries like North Korea. You have Russia, who had no real relationship with North Korea prior to this, since they leaving communism, now buddying up, with North Korea, and North Koreans fighting in the Ukraine on behalf of Russia. China, closing the gap and buddying up with, in other words, this whole war thing has created alliances that I think are very dangerous. And so I don't think it's a good thing that we've seen what's happened. So I do think that we need to relook at our, this notion that of world dominance or hegemony and what is our place in the world? Do we focus on like think about like how much money we've spent just in our defense budget that could have been put to infrastructure,
Hmm.
which we are majorly behind in. I mean, like you can look at other countries that are developing nations that now have better infrastructure than us because our infrastructure was built, 50, 60 years ago, and we got bridges falling apart. We've got, places that like here in West Virginia, for example, that don't even have internet, and I'm talking about like where I live. The only reason I even have internet is because of Starlink, and
Yep. Yep.
and not everybody here can even get it.
Well,
So
this is the beauty of technology and entrepreneurs like Musk and others who have incredible creative minds and are able to do things that the government couldn't do it in 1,000 years. Look what's happening in Newark Airport, where I used to fly out of when I lived in New Jersey. I mean, from what we know, it's pretty dangerous flying in and out of Newark now because of the traffic control situation. They don't even have modern computers, which is a scandal. So where have presidents been and their transportation departments over the years? This thing should be privatized because no private company could get away with this and still be in business. I mean, the beauty of the free market is if you don't serve the customer well, you don't have safety and quality, you're going out of business. So you're going to get sued up the gazoo, as they say, because you've committed fraud or misfeasance or malfeasance. So again, the answer, I think, is pretty straightforward. Give it into the hands of people who know how to allocate resources better than government bureaucrats, because government bureaucrats don't have skin in the game, to use an expression. They are just overseers. They don't have any money at stake. They don't have any capital at stake. And it's the people who have the capital at stake that have to make sure that product leaves the factory in great shape. And that's why when I learned about the free market and the history of business and the history of finance and money, I said, why are we still doing things that are comparable to kings and monarchs and authoritarian governments, as opposed to what the founders gave us, which is a limited government republic?
yeah, yeah. I was you were making me think about something. There's a principle, and I learned about this in cryptocurrency, and it's actually I think it's called Nakamoto's coefficient. And are you familiar with it?
No, that's one area I haven't done a deep dive.
So it's really interesting. It's this idea, and really what it boils down to, and I'll try to simplify it, but because I don't want to spend too much time on it, is because we're coming up on the hour here. But the idea behind it is they were looking at things like Bitcoin, and Bitcoin. They saw that it was a problem, that there was a problem in that it was not decentralized enough. Like, in other words, the Bitcoin itself was decentralized, but the servers, the mining systems, everything that it rides upon, everything that basically the infrastructure of it was not decentralized. And in fact, a lot of it was in China, a significant amount of it. And the fear was that if all of a sudden there was a policy shift, it could basically disrupt it big time. If they shut down the mining rigs and all of that. And then they looked at Ethereum, which was another, big, cryptocurrency, and it had a similar problem. And so there were, I think, like Solana and some others, decided, hey, we need to have it decentralized enough. Like, centralization provides certain benefits, right? Provides efficiency. But it also creates problems because you have single point of failure. You have, a problem where if you have everything in one place and all of a sudden there's some natural disaster, it takes it out. I mean, that's the benefit of that's been the whole principle of the internet, right? Was, an ARPANET that the military created, was having decentralization creates security, but it does create inefficiencies. And I've been reading a book right now which has been really plaguing my mind on these very issues. I think it's called 1 Second After, and it's about this. It's a novel fiction, but it's based on real documented evidence of things that have happened in other collapses around the world. And it's also it's looking at documents that have proposed of what would happen if there was an EMP that went off and took out all electronics and electricity in the United States. It's a frightening book. But the single biggest problem of why everything falls apart is because we were so used to convenience and so used to everything being able to be shipped everywhere and get to every part of the United States and all of that, that when the power went out across the country and there was no way to quickly get it back online, the theory, and it is a theory that has been proposed by a lot of people within the intelligence community and within our, even in our Department of Defense, is that it would be catastrophic because of how things are not decentralized enough, how everything is so centralized that, you wouldn't even be able to get food in most of your cities.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to get water. You wouldn't be able to get medicine because there's one company that produces, all of the, and in this, thing, they talk about insulin and for example, like there's one company that makes the bags that, for IVs. There's one company that makes the glass bottles down in Mexico for like 90% of the, the insulin that's great. So how do we, when we look at planning and we look at, because if we just allow everything just to go full free market, right? Eventually it's going to lead to some situation or some catastrophe or whatever. And everything's gonna be so spread out. You're not gonna have any industry in your own town. If you end up with a disruption like what we saw with COVID, right? Where we saw ships that were lined up out to sea, that couldn't even get into port, and you had product that was spoiling, before it could even get into port. Where's the balance? How do we figure that out? Because I agree with you. I think free market is best, but I also do see a risk in it as well. If it's just completely.
Well, there's a risk in everything that we do. I mean, think of how many people slip and fall in the shower every day in the United States, or fall down the steps, or fall off the curb, or get into an accident. I mean, life is full of risk. The way we mitigate risk is we are very careful in what we do. And as far as an economy goes, we know government can't plan. If the government can plan, the Soviet Union would still exist, and they would have the greatest economy in the world, because there are a cornucopia of natural resources. Having studied Soviet geography back as an undergraduate, they have virtually every natural resource under the sun. And China has a lot of the rare earth minerals as well. The reason that the United States is so powerful is because we have one big free trade area in the United States. We have friendly neighbors to the north and south. And so Canada, the United States, and Mexico is a natural free trade area because of its geography and sort of a common economic interest to have goods and services move smoothly between the three countries. And so, again, like I say, I think we could improve the infrastructure and the economy of the United States by reducing taxes and regulation. So businesses that are now overseas, that have been there for decades, because the cost of doing business has risen dramatically throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. And that's why companies went overseas, not because they wanted to go, because it was in their self-interest to go overseas because of what the government was doing to them. So if the government undoes what it does to them, we would have companies coming back to the United States. And that, I think, is the experiment worth having.
Now, do you recognize, or do you see the problem with like monopolization? I mean, that clearly, obviously, our founders who totally were for capitalism also saw the risk, though, that ultimately the efficiencies of capitalism do lead towards, centralization, and do lead towards monopoly. Do you see a problem with that today with some of our corporations? I mean, I think there's 5 companies that own like all the major media outlets. There's a handful of companies that own most of the corporations that are out there that produce food and things like that.
Well, this is a great question because it goes at the heart of the notion that the government has to intervene in the economy to help the consumer. That is a myth that's been exploded by the Austrian school economists, because after all, if we don't like what a company is doing, whether it's a media company or a cell phone company or whatever, we don't buy that good and service. In other words, if people don't like channel X, they go to channel Y. If they don't like streaming service A, they go streaming service B. It's the consumer that's in charge. And most people don't recognize that, especially the politicians. They think corporations have all this power. If they have all this power, why don't they raise their prices 100% tomorrow or Monday? Because they can't, because there's the thing called the demand curve. And the demand curve and the supply curve interact to give us market prices. That is the beauty of a free enterprise economy. And Bernie Sanders doesn't understand it. Elizabeth Warren, AOC, the rest of that crowd, they don't understand it. Unfortunately, too many Republicans are falling in line with them, saying we've got to have government regulation in technology and other fields. I mean, if you don't like what Apple does, if you don't like what Google does, there are alternatives to Google. There are alternatives to Apple. There are alternatives to the Mac 7, the Netflix. I mean, people have choices in this world. It's the government that's the monopoly. The government has monopoly in the post office. Think about that. The government has a monopoly. So what's happening? The government the post office is hemorrhaging money because people are using email and other services. The automobile industry used to have big three. Now you have basically two companies in the United States: Chrysler, not Chrysler, but Ford and GM. GM at one time had 60% of the market share. Now I think it has less than 20% because the competition has come in from overseas, and they're building magnificent cars that the American people want. It's all about consumer demand and consumer preferences, and about the value that a company brings to the marketplace. And the consumer determines that, not the producer. That's the great myth, is that producers have all this power. Well, if they had all this power, then every company would be making money hand over fist. But we know some companies are losing money. Companies are closing down. They're going out of business. And that's because they haven't been able to meet consumer needs.
Now, you've argued that political elites have hijacked the Constitution. Can you give specific examples and how this happens and what it means for individual freedom?
Well, I think we're seeing it right now playing out at Harvard. From my perspective, let's end all government grants to colleges and institutions. They're nonprofit organizations. They should be able to raise the money from people who support their mission. That's the way it works in a free society. You support the mission of the nonprofit that you think is doing great work. Harvard has a $55 billion endowment. That professor should not get any money from the taxpayer through grants.
Right. Why do they need exactly 100%?
I mean, this is so crazy. I mean, it drives me nuts, having been in the classroom for 35 years, that we have all these elite institutions saying they have to be on the government dole in order to survive. That's nonsense. I mean, the government doesn't create wealth, it destroys wealth through the Federal Reserve and spending and regulation. This is something, it's so easy to understand, yet that the geniuses in Congress and in the media and some economics departments around the country seem to realize that government spending is the Alexa for the economy. That is pure myth and pure nonsense.
Yeah. I've always kind of equated it to, there are two industries in this country that have the most government intervention, and they are the most screwed up, right? And one of those is education, higher education, and the other is healthcare. Neither of those seem to be operating on free market economy at all. When you have a university that does not even consider the Department of Labor and Statistics and what they say is going to be the upcoming jobs in their determination of what degrees to offer, or when you have something like, when every single degree program is the same cost, when, there's not a need for, every degree. I mean, it's like they operate in a world that doesn't make any sense, mainly because they got guaranteed, loans that are going to be created by the federal government, which of course has driven the cost of higher education up significantly. I think that was like one of the highest inflation rates of all of the things in the economy over the last 30 years has been a public or a higher education. And so they, if you want to get a degree in basket weaving or you want to get a degree in engineering, it doesn't make sense the way that they market those, the way that they charge for those, the way that they, are producing it. So you get a bunch of people who get, heavy laden with debt, and they graduate and then they can't find a job because they got some degree in women's studies, thinking that there was going to be jobs out there for that.
Yeah. I mean, a core curriculum, I would have a core curriculum, and you'd love this: history, geography, economics, philosophy, and finance. That's a core curriculum where you learn everything about how the world evolved. Another subject that is fascinating, I only took, I think, 1 or 2 courses through my career, is anthropology, where you learn about different cultures and how they organize themselves. But you could pick that up through a geography course or a history course as well. So that would be my approach to developing a curriculum. That would be a Common Core curriculum instead of all these crazy courses that they have out there for Common Core. I mean, philosophy is where you learn logic, about you learn ethics, you learn about all the other parts of philosophy. To me, that's what makes you a well-rounded individual, a liberal arts person. And so again, people need to know about basic finance. They don't even know about basic finance. I mean, kids graduate college. They don't know anything about the business world.
Yeah. And healthcare is the other area that is just very, very bad. I mean, you look at it like you can't, nobody knows what they're actually paying, you know, for different procedures. We don't know. Now, you know, and where I saw the difference in this, where I saw what happens if you don't have insurance or you don't have a heavily regulated industry, all you got to do is go to Thailand. And when I was in Japan, everybody in Japan, if they needed dental work, they went to Thailand because they could go get dental work there, really good dental work, by the way, for like $100. You know, if they needed a MRI or a CAT scan, they went to Thailand because it was cheaper. Because they could just, you know, it's $100. You know, it's like it's insane the way that and a lot of it also has to do with the, you know, the insurance and you know, that has to be carried by the doctors and I mean, it's like, you know, the amount of school that they have to go to, which I'm glad that they go to a lot of school, but they don't. It's some of it is unnecessary. Some of it they don't like. It's amazing how many actual doctors never took a single course in nutrition, you know, and understand. They don't understand the impact of a lack of certain necessary vitamins, minerals, you know, amino acids, and how that may be contributing to disease. So we're really great in this country about surgery, especially microsurgery and all of the things that we could sew somebody's arm back on. We can sew a face onto somebody, but we can't seem to solve things like diabetes, you know, and heart disease, and you know, these diseases that kill us here because we don't understand those things.
Well, from what I researched and what I've written about is that there have been two horrific mistakes in the evolution of American healthcare or medical care. One is employer-based medical insurance, because we're trying to insure every expense that a person has when they see a doctor or a specialist. That should not be the case. You should pay out of pocket for your basic health needs and have a catastrophic policy for surgery. Even that could
catastrophic plan.
Even that could be done cheaply. There's the Surgery Center of Oklahoma. When I was doing my first book, I interviewed a direct primary care physician in Fort Myers, Florida, and I spent a lot of time on the phone with her. And she told me she had a patient with no insurance who needed a surgery. I think it was a knee surgery. And the local hospital quoted him $20,000 price tag for the operation, which of course he couldn't afford. So she told him, why don't you call the Surgery Center of Oklahoma to see what they would charge you? He's based in Florida. Surgery Center is in Tulsa. He called them up. They quoted him a price of $5,000, the surgery, the anesthesia, the stay in the hotel. He could do $5,000, but not $20,000. So the problem in America, and then of course Medicare and Medicaid, which made doctors basically civil servants of the federal government and state governments. What we need to do is restore the doctor-patient relationship. The problem in America is we're overinsured, over-medicated, and undernourished. That causes chronic conditions in America, the undernourishment. People are eating a lot of calories. The overweight, the obesity problem in America is through the roof. It's going to get worse by 2030. And that leads to all sorts of chronic illnesses. And that's the main reason that the American people are spending nearly $5 trillion on medical care, nearly 20% of GDP. We could probably get that down 50% if we had doctors working with their patients to improve their health by tweaking their lifestyle, by giving them good advice. And like you pointed out, a friend of mine just wrote a book that will be published soon. He's a naturopath doctor in New Jersey, and he just wrote a book. He sent me the table of contents, the preface and the introduction. It's going to be a primer on how to stay well, not so much the specifics of it. It's really an interesting book. It's called The Health Paradox, why we don't follow what we're supposed to be doing in order to remain healthy. And This is the challenge we have. And the more government that got involved, as you pointed out, healthcare costs have gone through the roof since Medicare and Medicaid were enacted 60 years ago, 1965. Johnson signed the Medicare and Medicaid bill. So we're coming up to the 60th anniversary. We're coming up to the 90th anniversary of Social Security. And that's why I wrote that article for the Mises Institute towards financial independence and a constitutional federal budget. We need to restore the independence of the American people, not only politically, but financially. And that's why this is my brand: make Americans financially independent. And we can do so if we downsize the federal government, strengthen the communities, strengthen the family, and do things that generations before the Great Depression used to do. It used to be about community, family, and individual, and it worked quite well.
Now, you on your Substack and in your work, you emphasize liberty and personal responsibility. How can we foster a culture of excellence and self-reliance in an era of growing government influence?
Well, that's what I'm doing. What I'm doing, Nate, is I'm trying to get on your podcast. Thank you for the invitation. Other podcasts, get on some of the big shows and say, listen, here we've had this experiment now for 100 years: the Federal Reserve, the income tax, the welfare state, the intervention overseas. And what would have the American people gotten for it? $37 trillion in debt. I'm saying the primary responsibility of parents is to teach youngsters to be responsible adults, to be financially independent. I don't know any family that teaches their kids to be financially dependent on the government. I don't know anybody that does that.
I think part of the problem is that we have created a culture of parents don't teach their kids anymore. They send them to school to get taught, and really they're getting indoctrinated there. They're not getting educated. And so I think part of it, and maybe this is the silver lining in COVID, is a lot of parents saw what was being taught in the classroom for the first time. And now I think more than any other time, probably, since the advent of public education, you got parents deciding to pull their kids out of public schools and to homeschool them, which I think is actually a really good thing.
Well, homeschool is the old-fashioned way, and it worked. The kids, there were kids that were reading and writing by the time they were 5, 6 years old. They could do the multiplication tables. They could read. They were curious about the world, like I was trying to learn about the different peoples and cultures around the world. Now kids are texting. They spend most of their time texting and doing other things, who knows what, on the internet with their phone. And kids don't read. They don't read books anymore. They don't read major articles anymore. The classics in history and philosophy and other subjects that are vital for understanding about the world we live in. And we live in a world where kids are just not doing what they need to do to be responsible adults. And everyone has a responsibility in this, especially the parents. I just spoke to somebody the other day about this. I said, if a child doesn't know how to read by the time they're 5, their parents have failed the kids. That's what you should be doing, teaching your children how to read. So when they go to school, they're curious and they want to learn. And instead, we have these factory schools that work for a time when the culture was a lot different, when a high school education meant something, where kids didn't have to go to college. They could become productive human beings by not going to college. And that culture has changed dramatically. And I think Trump has a good idea about trade schools, but the federal government should not get involved. This should be done at the local level, because there are young people. When I lived in New Jersey, we're getting ready to sell our house. One gentleman came to do a power washing of the house, and he said his son works for a car dealer, foreign car dealer. He was making $150,000 a year, and this is nearly 20 years ago. $150,000 a year as a 25-year-old as a car mechanic, because you needed to have great skills today with the computer to be a car mechanic. Could you imagine young people making $100,000 a year, 6 figures, doing something that's not a white-collar job, but is vital for the U.S. economy, whether it's a truck mechanic, an auto mechanic, or any of the electrician, plumber?
Our coal miners here in West Virginia, that's a 6-figure job. And, they make really good money at it. And unfortunately, the Biden administration's policies really damaged a lot of the, it hurt us. But West Virginia, I think, is doing something that I think is brilliant. This last session, they passed a bill. I think it's House Bill 2014, and it basically creates this opportunity for businesses to data centers to move here to West Virginia and have their own personal private power grid and power plant created. And, so it's because it's not connected to the national grid. Federal government doesn't have any say in it. So we can build gas powered, we can build coal powered power plants. And I think it was a brilliant move. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to get away from federal regulation and start, charting our own course and utilizing those resources that we have available. And this is like the perfect place to do it, because we've got, like, nowadays, you don't need a whole bunch of employees living in West Virginia to be able to run and operate the technical side. It can all be done remotely now. But what you do in creating these data centers is you're going to create a lot of jobs surrounding energy, which we already have a lot of people that have knowledge in that. Because you're going to be building these power plants. You're going to have all of the service jobs for, like, maintenance, the HVAC and all of that goes into the construction jobs. And then all of the service jobs, that surround, those industries, which I think it's going to be a great boom for West Virginia. And that's what needs to happen, I think, in every state.
Salad bars to keep people healthy.
Yes. Do you remember they used to have those places? Soup Plantation, I think, was the name of it.
Well, there was one here. There was one here. We used to patronize it when we drove down to Florida years ago, and COVID knocked them out. Called what was it called? Sweet Tomatoes. It was a buffet. It was fabulous. It was probably the best value out there. You had, I don't know, half a dozen or more soups. You had salads. You had dessert. I mean, you could eat. You could feast. I shouldn't say eat. You could feast for like $10, $12. I mean, it's incredible. And COVID just knocked them out.
Yeah. Well, it's ridiculous. I think we are getting back to the point, though, and maybe this is the benefit of some of the inflation. I go to McDonald's now, and it's ridiculous how much money, I spend going through just getting garbage food. And so if I'm going to spend, $20, $30 on a meal at McDonald's, why don't I just go spend $20, $30 and get something healthy? And I think that is becoming a reality now.
Yeah, not to plug anybody, but we love Panera. We go to Panera's as not frequently, but the food quality is really good. There's a lot of good things on the menu, and in fact, we were just there today, and they're adding new items. So again, we like to eat as clean as possible because, quite frankly, you are what you eat. I mean, so if you eat drinking sodas and snacking constantly, it's going to be reflected in your health.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're just about out of time, Murray, and I want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing your insights. I think they're invaluable, and we need more discussions like this, because there's a lot of things that, like I said, that I think that people get their ideas about the world and about the economy and all of that from the mainstream media, and I don't think that they get a fair picture of what's really going on. And I was just talking to somebody just yesterday, actually, a young lady that I was getting a haircut, and this young lady came in, and we got to talking about politics and talking about the economy, and she's taking an economics class. And so it was interesting, but we had a good, healthy, friendly debate, and I think that's important, because I think when you can have those kind of discussions, that's when you have your ideals challenged, that's when you can maybe take a step back and look at things and see things from a different perspective. So I appreciate you doing that with me today, and in bringing your ideas to the table. Now, we talked about a lot of things, and I always like to ask the final question: is if there's one thing that you want people to take away from our conversation, what would that be?
Well, the one thing I want to take, I'd like the people to realize from my life's work and writing about these subjects is that freedom is the most important thing that we can have, because it would make everything else possible. Strong families, strong communities, strong businesses, and peace. That's the other thing. It would result in more peace in the world. And when everyone has the responsibility to do what they do best, whatever skills that they have, we will have a strong economy, international peace, and the future will be bright. But if we rely on politicians to solve, quote, our problems, we will just be more dependent upon big government, and we know that is not the solution. The solution is the legacy of the founders' document, which is the Declaration and the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always close my show in prayer, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I recognize that there's a lot that we have to do, but we certainly need to ask for help from on high. I think that, our founders, they understood it as providence, and I see it that way myself. Heavenly Father, I thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to have this discussion. Lord, I thank you for the work that Murray has been doing, and I thank you for this enlightening conversation and topic to talk about tonight. I pray, Lord, that you would give wisdom to those in power, that they would see the benefit of liberty and freedom and deregulation, and that they would remove the obstacles to growth, economic growth, and create a environment where we can, where an entrepreneur can start from nothing and can succeed in finding the American dream, and ultimately in benefiting his community and society around him. Lord, I do pray for wisdom, for balance, and for those areas where we do need to take certain considerations into place, that you would help us to walk that path, a balance where we need to take into consideration technologies and things like that we need to ensure exist here in the United States. But I also pray that if there's a way to do that with by creating more liberty, that you would help us to find that. Lord, I thank you for everybody that watched the show tonight, and just pray your blessing over them and over our country and its leaders. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. Murray, thank you again for being on the show. And where can people follow you? Where can they connect with you and find your work?
MurraySabrin.substack.com. And I just want to give a plug for a debate I'll be having on July 25th, scheduled at 5 p.m. at the Mises Institute in Alabama. It'll be streamed live on Mises Media on YouTube, and it'll be a great discussion about tariffs and trade and the structure of the U.S. economy. So July 25th, 5 p.m. Eastern time at the Mises Institute. So I'm looking forward to having a lively discussion about a topic that's in the news constantly.
Absolutely. That's going to be, I'm excited about that. That's something I've been saying for a long time. We need to bring back, if anything we need to add to public education, it's debate. Because people don't know how to debate anymore. All they do is they yell at each other and they get into arguments and ad hominem attacks, and none of that is productive. But debate is something that is productive, because you get to hear two different people with two different ideas bring the argument forward, and whoever has the more compelling argument, I think that's the way to go. We need to teach people that art of rhetoric again. I think that's a great thing. And show us your book, the new book that you have that's out right now.
This is my memoir, From Immigrant to Public Intellectual, and it traces my journey from the time we came to America in 1949 to my first political campaign in 1997, when I ran for governor in New Jersey and was the first third-party candidate to be included in the debates with the two major candidates, because I raised enough money to qualify for matching funds. And even though I didn't win, obviously, I had an impact on public policy, and that's all in the book.
That's great. That's awesome. And thank you for your service and for running, because I think that as somebody who ran myself for Congress this last year, I can tell you that folks out there, look, it's not easy. It is really hard. It takes a lot of time and effort to run. And even if you don't win, the benefit of going through that experience was connecting and meeting so many wonderful people and understanding issues and problems going on in West Virginia that I had no idea about. And it really opened my eyes. I would say it was one of the greatest educations I've ever had. And so I want to thank you, Murray, and God bless you and the work that you're doing. And I look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks so much, Nate. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this evening.
Thank you. And thank you, folks, for joining. We've had about a little over 1,400 people tonight live watching the show. And I want to thank all of you for listening. Please check out Murray's book. And where is your, can you tell people how to find you on Substack?
MurraySabrin.substack.com. And on the back, you can see all my 5 other books. My first book on how to create a tax-free America, Why the Federal Reserve Sucks, the 2 books on healthcare, and the other book on navigating the boom bust cycle, all available on Amazon.
Wonderful. All right. Have a wonderful night, and God bless you, and God bless America.
Thank you, Nate. Great to be with you.
Raise some Cain. You gotta raise some Cain. in the heartland where the faith runs strong. We've seen the shadows growing long. Watch those around us be deceived. Yeah, the fight is at our doors, no matter who we believe. Corruption, lawless day and night, we'll speak the truth into the light. We'll bring the battle, heed the call, watch the whole thing fall. We gotta raise some Cain, show the lies, break some chains and make things right. Feel the power, be the change, the time is now. We gotta raise some Cain.